Hi everyone. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Ian. This is Brooklyn Public Philosophers. Welcome if this is your first time here. It's a monthly public philosophy discussion group that brings philosophers from the greater Brooklyn area and beyond to share their work with several audiences. So I'm really glad that Jason Stanley can join us from Yale. He's the author of several books, most recently How Propaganda Works. This is the library's copy, so any card holders who want to check it out, you can fight to the death for it. Anyway, so Professor Stanley is going to be speaking on democracy and the demagogue, so please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a long dream of mine to give a public lecture in Brooklyn. My family lives in Ocean Parkway. So in 1988, George Bush Sr. ran what is widely now considered one of the most racist ads in history. Though, curiously, at the time, it was not recognized as such. I'm talking about the Willie Horton. And at the time, it was very controversial. I mean, first of all, nobody mentioned that it was a racist ad until I think like 16 or 17 weeks into the campaign, sometime in October, when Jesse Jackson said that stood up and said they're playing the race card, and that's a racist ad. And then Jesse Jackson was accused of playing the race card, was lambasted everywhere, and essentially sort of lost his position in public space. However, what he said had a big effect. Bush's poll numbers kept dropping, and he barely won the election. And in retrospect, it's very, very clear that Lee Atwater was, that was an incredibly racist ad. It's taught as such. And later, a very famous quote from Lee Atwater surfaced, who was the person who created that ad. Almost everyone, many people have heard it. He says, and this is a 1981 interview, which was later revealed to be him. You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. So in retrospect, it was clear that this is what Atwater was doing. He begged to apologize to Dukakis on his deathbed. And this is an iteration of politics that we are completely familiar with since the 1970s. And we play it out again and again. Paul Ryan wrote this 200-page thing on like the problems of the inner city, the problems of laziness, and everyone called him on it. Everyone was like, wait, hold on, that's clearly racist. So, Tally Mendelberg, in a brilliant 2001 book, The Race Card, argues that after the civil rights movement, a norm of racial equality came to arise. Now, I think her expression, norm of racial equality, is too much. It still seems to me that politicians in the United States had to appeal to long-standing, of course, as we know, did appeal to long-standing racist associations, blacks in crime and laziness. But nevertheless, Mendelberg shows quite persuasively that when politicians get explicitly called on being racist, they lose popularity. So Bush, after Jesse Jackson heroically got up and called him on the racism of his ad, Bush started losing popularity. And he barely won the election. He dropped like 10 points. People don't remember this. So what Jackson did had an effect. Okay, fast forward to the present day. We're used to this dialectic. We're used to, in 2012, Juan Williams confronted Newt Gingrich in the Republican debates and said, can't you see that when you say people in the inner city have a work ethic problem, that is damaging to those of us, in minority groups? And Newt Gingrich said, no, I don't see this at all. I think a work ethic is good, completely denying the associations. But, so we're used to this game. But what has happened recently, right now, in the present day, is something quite interesting. Something that I didn't expect when I wrote this book. Donald Trump made his presidential announcement in which he said words that you would think, words that were certainly not coded. He said Mexicans are rapists. And he entered the race. I mean, if you can rewind your minds to before his presidential announcement, no one thought he was a serious candidate. He jumped hugely in the polls. He was still behind Jeb Bush, but then people got used to the idea of him as a serious candidate. I don't think we can discount the possibility that his desire to explicitly engage in, to take us back, as it were, to the days of George Wallace. I don't think we can discount that as an explanation for his popularity. Ben Carson recently said, the United States cannot have a Muslim president. He too jumped in popularity and has been exploring themes of division in his run. So we've got these two candidates explicitly exploring themes of division. If there are code words, at least as Tali Mendelberg says, there's a pretense that we're not doing that. But I'm going to put it out there that that pretense, however thin it was, may be starting to break down. And what I want to talk about is why that matters and why it happened. So I want to give a theory of why it happened, and then I want to go a little normative and talk about why it matters and what problem this raises for democracy. Because you see, I don't see that Trump means his anti-Hispanic comments. I mean, he has no record. He's a record of racism, as we know from the Central Park 5 jogger case. But he doesn't have a specific record of anti-immigrant sentiment. So we must entertain the possibility that he's taking this as a strategic move. And we have to ask ourselves, why would this be appealing as a strategic move? Surely it wasn't in the past. And then just a little thing about, I am not comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. I think that's an absurd comparison. I think he clearly is doing this as a strategic move. That must make some difference. I just want to point out one thing. People also thought that Hitler was doing this as a strategic move. So here is Victor Klemperer talking in his famous diaries, talking about talking about the arguments he would have with people saying, well, don't be absurd, Hitler's totally not serious, which is a theme I see again also in my grandmother's memoirs, who was in Berlin, lived through the war years in Berlin. So you're taking it, so he's talking about a tenant that he rented his, grad student, he rented his apartment. This is what professors do. Victor Klemperer is a professor of Romance Studies who lived through the Second World War and wrote these famous diaries about it. So he's arguing with this tenant of his who is a grad student or something. He says, and the student says to him, "You're taking it much too seriously, Baba. The fuss and bother about the Jews is only there for propaganda purposes. You wait, when Hitler is at the helm, he'll be far too busy to insult the Jews." Now, here's a big difference between Hitler and Donald Trump. Hitler was very serious. That's not to say that if you're insincere, you can't be led to dramatic tasks. I mean, people might hold you to account. But I think that's a large difference. Nevertheless, I don't think sincerity and insincerity matters that much. I think both of these attitudes are popular under certain circumstances and are a fundamental threat to democracy. So that's what I want to explain. So I'm going to embed this worry. So this book, my book, is all about code words. It's all assuming we have a commitment to liberal democracy. And so if we're going to be politicians or be in the media, we have to give a defensible reason why we're not. But if you're saying Muslims can't be president and Mexicans are rapists, some of them are good people, you're not pretending. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bury this worry that I have, that we should all have, with someone doing what Trump is doing, in a long history of theorizing about political philosophy. So if you begin with Book 8 of Plato's Republic, which is going back a long way. In Book 8, Plato, I think, more than others, aptly describes the chief features of democracy. So it's typical to say he doesn't have positive freedom. He doesn't. It's typical to say the Greeks have positive and not negative freedom. But in Book 8 of the Republic, Plato describes a city in terms of the democratic city. And he's going back and forth between the soul of a person and the soul of and the character of a city throughout the Republic. And Book 8 in particular, where that's Book 8 is analogies between between a person with a certain character and a city with a certain character. And Plato's description of democracy is in terms of the ideals of liberty and equality. So in a democratic city, you're going to find liberty as the most prized value. And because people give each other liberty to do what they want, so this is then the negative freedom point, then people will respect each other's paths and give each other equal space to negotiate their lives. And I think that's a fairly good description of democracy. Now there's different conceptions of democracy, but I think we can say with this. And Plato uses it to frame a worry for democracy, which is not his favorite system, liberal democracy. He says, look, people are easily confused, they're easily made fearful in conditions of inequality, they're resentful, they're angry. So if liberty is involved, if anyone is able to say whatever they want, freedom of speech, then you will get a towering despot, he calls it in the English translation, who will present himself as a protector of the people against against some threat from inside. And he will win votes, and because he's of course run for office by rejecting the values of democracy, equality, giving people equal respect to pursue their interests. There's no reason he will respect it once he gets in. And I think you see this with the American South, or the American North under mass incarceration, where people didn't see the perspectives of certain people, and then ruled in a way, and then formed policy in a way to cut down their democratic rights. So, I mean, if you scapegoat a certain group, you're not going to respect their democratic rights. And you can see mass incarceration, as my colleague Vegetable Weaver has argued, as an attempt to rob people of their democratic rights. I mean, it's certainly more than that. So Plato says this is an inevitable outcome of democracy. So Plato doesn't favor democracy. Plato favors a system that philosophers like, which is philosopher rulers, where we decide on behalf of everyone else. So Plato sees the worry for democracy. He sees the worry for democracy. He sees that people in conditions of inequality will be tempted by resentment, by a host of irrational feelings. They'll respect, or will be led to admire those in power for illegitimate reasons. And we've seen that. One of my colleagues, John DeVideo, and Suzanne, one of his students, I'll say her name in the question session, just showed that American, implicit association test, Americans highly identify with middle-class Americans have strongly positive views of the wealthy. So, and of course, there are implicit associations between poverty. And so there's all these things. There's race, there's class, there's gender, all of which, in conditions of inequality, can become focuses of resentment. So Plato favors this alternative, and the alternative kind of meshes with James Madison's idea of representative democracy, where representative democracy is a system where we appoint people who will rule on our behalf in the common interest, and will put their interests, their partial interests aside. So that's Federalist 10. They were very clear about the worry that people would be partial. So there's both a sort of Platonic, sort of scary authoritarian way of responding to the worry, like forget democracy, don't even have a representative democracy. And then there's this sort of middle way where we try to appoint people who we think best represent us. And you can see why that system of representative democracy, by its structure, is supposed to prevent us from electing people who only care about the Christians, or who only care about the rich, or who only care about the poor. Because we're supposed to elect people who care about the common interest. So that's why you need code words and dog whistles. So what's happening when suddenly it's popular to just go after them? And it looks like Plato, and it looks like Plato is being vindicated. Now I'm going to move on to my hypothesis about what has happened. And this is a hypothesis that I've traced through a series of New York Times Stone pieces since 2011. I think that there is breakdown, I don't think I'd be the first to point out that there is a breakdown of public trust. And it has legitimate sources. So one legitimate source is the breakdown of our campaign financing system. Martin Gillens has found that, the Princeton political scientist, has found that the policy decisions of the Congress mirror the policy views of the top, I think, 1%. It might be even lower than that. And now, of course, you find broad concern, for instance, with campaign finance legislation. Republicans and Democrats both want campaign finance legislation. But what happened? Why don't we get it? Why doesn't Congress legislate for it? Republicans and Democrats want something to be done about the financial system, the environment. Well, what happens is that there's this tissue of distrust where one group says, oh, the climate scientists are all just trying to trick you into being gay, roughly. You know, like, they're not sincere. So the breakdown of our campaign finance system has led our politicians to have to be openly insincere. They have to pretend that what's in the interests of Facebook and Apple is in our interests. What's in the interests of tech companies in California is in the common interest. Because that's the only way you can raise $60 to $100 million in 2 years as a senator. I mean, every 6 years, but in the last 2 years before, I mean, campaigns are getting incredibly expensive. So you're going to have to pretend that, you're going to have to be insincere about what's in the common interest. And then you have a media presence that has gone crazy that targets specifically trust. So what they target, is they target honesty, they target sincerity. No doubt there's lots of insincerity. The president's largest campaign funder, I believe in 2008, was Goldman Sachs, and he put Larry Summers and Tim Geithner in charge of the economy. No doubt there's some insincerity. But what we have is a conspiracy theory so bad about sincerity that the majority of Republicans in a recent Pew poll said they believed that President Obama was Muslim. Which is, one shouldn't even address it, but it shows absolutely no knowledge of the Luo and what they're, and who they are. Okay, so there's this huge problem with sincerity. Like, actually, it looks like from a certain perspective, Lawrence Lessig argues this, that the vast majority of Americans do want campaign finance reform. But they think that if the Democrats push it, then it's just going to be a means to win elections. So they just don't trust it. So that's the first layer of my explanation. There's a breakdown, there's a crisis of public trust. Nobody trusts anyone anymore. And the language of efficiency, is it a refuge, the language of efficiency? Well, if you look at what happened in Detroit, with Detroit being declared so-called bankrupt, and you look at, and their governor, who runs on this sort of like neutrality and efficiency platform, where he declared that all of the mayors of Detroit's majority black cities were in financial emergency and removed them and replaced them by emergency managers for efficiency, for financial efficiency. And then, Detroit becomes a city where you move whites in, and who is that efficient for? And they call it civics. Let me get the terminology right for what is happening in Detroit, where they call it. civic, I think civic renewal. It's something else, but we can imagine it's like civic renewal, creating wealthy neighborhoods where there's no spaces where you can gather and you can police each, everyone has their private space, and you call it like, civic, creating a civic space. So it looks like the language you can't flee to like the language of neutral economics to escape insincerity. So people are sick of insincerity. It looks like on the one hand you have a sort of feckless tools of the power elite, Scott Walker, but so Scott Walker, who just sort of like in a sort of comic book fashion went after public education. He wanted to replace it just with jobs education, like to bring back Booker T. Washington for everyone, against the Du Bois conception of a liberal education. So people are disgusted. So they seek someone who can seem strong, authentic, and one can't dismiss this. One can't dismiss the desire for authenticity. I mean, Adorno's 1964, The Jargon of Authenticity, is all about the seductive power of authenticity. I mean, some of the greatest thinkers on earth, I mean, especially if you tend towards a Central European romanticism like I do, fell to this. Heidegger, Carl Schmitt. They thought that this is not a new dilemma, the idea that all politics is strategic. Wilfred Pareto, the Italian economist in 1901, writes, Buddhism, which proclaimed the equality of all men, has generated the theocracy of Tibet and the religion of Christ, which seemed especially made for the poor and humble, has generated the Roman theocracy. The decline of the old elite and its increasing arrogance at the time of the Reformation can be clearly seen in the emergence of the robber barons. As usual, the new elite leaned on the poor and humble. As usual, these believed in the promises made to them. As usual, they were deceived, and the yoke weighed even heavier on their shoulders than before. Similarly, the revolution of 1789 produced a Jacobin oligarchy and ended with imperial despotism. This is what has always happened, and there is no reason to believe that the usual course of events should change now. So there is a clear-eyed view here that it is about power, it is about strength, it is imposing your view, that is what politics is. Carl Schmitt, the political theorist of the National Socialism, whom by the way, Rick Snyder, the governor of Michigan, seems to have, a lot of these people seem to have read Carl Schmitt, goddammit. I mean, Snyder names everything. Schmitt says, in liberal democracy, you can't get people to go to war because who would sacrifice their life for the good of others? So you have to like have the language of emergency, like scare people. So it's not a democratic moment. But then Schmitt says, somebody's just going to call everything an emergency then, and just make decisions on your behalf. And that's what we see in Michigan, with financial emergency this, financial emergency that. So Schmitt had this powerful critique of liberal democracy, and Schmitt's view, all political concepts, images, and terms have a polemical meaning. They are focused on a specific conflict and are bound to a concrete situation. The result, which manifests itself in war or revolution, is a friend-enemy grouping, and they turn into empty and ghost-like abstractions when this situation disappears. That's a view. Some very smart people have gone down that road. And it's not all dark. If you read Greg Grandin's new book on Kissinger, Grandin represents Kissinger, and I haven't read it, I've just been reading about it, but Grandin represents Kissinger as sort of debating with Ellsberg, who was sort of bringing economics and to bear on foreign policy decisions, and was very metaphysical and very, the exact, very romantic about creating your own destiny. And we remember this from Karl Rove, like, an empire creates its own reality. So there is a desire for this. And there's a desire for it because people are sick of hypocrisy, what they see as hypocrisy. Now, it's important, so how do we respond? Well, I think what's important, the way that's important to respond is by defending democratic culture, as goofy as it sounds. The idea is standing up to political correctness, standing up to those who say you should respect the perspectives of others, is brave, is an act of bravery. I think we need to challenge this. And it's tricky because there are pressures on the other side. Elizabeth Warren's website, as Kate Mann pointed out to me, says, it's enough taking the perspectives of the wealthy into account. Let's just focus on the rest of us. So that looks like she is engaging in the same move of excluding perspectives and getting us upset. So, is she doing the same thing as Trump? Doesn't power matter? Yes, I think here is where, if you defend democracy, you can still say that power matters. The wealthy, as Gillen's research shows, have had a vastly overweighed influence on policy. So their perspectives have been more than heard. I mean, this is what's going on when people say all lives matter. You're like, wait. The reason that is problematic is because that sense of equality, that goes on with the power relations. So when you're saying all lives matter, you're trying to pretend that black lives and white lives have been of equal value when they clearly have not been. So you're trying to pretend, give this illusion. You can be democratic. You shouldn't collapse into these two poles of, it's a battle between this perspective and that perspective. I think that there is a way to respect equality, taking into account power. And what needs to be emphasized, what we need to do is emphasize that character takes a lot of strength to have. It takes a lot of strength. It takes a lot more strength if you are a devout Christian, especially given the 8th and 9th century, to admit that, to see the perspective of Islam, and to see the perspective of the atheist. That takes much more strength to take multiple perspectives into account. That seems like a strong, powerful character trait, not simply excluding other perspectives. So we need to engage in what was a huge topic in Black America in the 19th and 20th century, when they faced, because blacks, women, the disabled, have faced these problems time and time again. And you find it, like, Frederick Douglass's speech on the 4th of July in 1852. It's like, really, we're celebrating freedom? There is a non-stop need in this country to engage in civic rhetoric, to wake people up to the values of democracy. That's what you see in Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk, trying to get people to see the values of democracy, to see why a democratic education is needed and not merely a vocational education. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton talks about what a liberal education does to you, even if you're imprisoned in menial domestic labor. She talks about a prisoner who just was able, when he was in prison, to just recite poetry over and over and over again to himself, and that's how he made it through being imprisoned. So we have to defend, as corny as it sounds, in the face of a very real argument for cynicism. By the way, let me go meta for a moment. The dialectic here is something like the dialectic in epistemology, when you have a really good argument that the external world doesn't exist, and everyone has to pretend that we do know the external world exists. I mean, we do know, but there's a really good argument that we don't know. But we epistemologists are all like, okay, we do know. How could it be that we know, given that we could be dreaming, we could be in the matrix, we could be grains in a vat? I kind of sometimes fear that democratic political philosophy in the face of the problems of power and demagoguery is like that it sounds hopeless, to get people to say, actually, paying attention to other people is a strength. That sounds corny in the same way as it sounds corny when Jim Pryor at NYU says, no, we just do know that this is a hand. Or Jeannie Moore famously said. But I think that's what we have to do. We have to, the prescription, I don't have many ways to convince people, to show people how one can do that. But I think the danger when we allow, we cannot allow the view that strength is just taking a certain perspective, come what may. I mean, it sounds pretty macho, I admit. when in the Bush Jr., the administration, we had a lot of very macho and foreign policy stamping the empire on the world, and this does have this romantic tradition. And but you can pretty much be guaranteed that anyone who tries to win office that way is going to ignore the perspectives. They're going to have to ignore the perspectives of those upon whose bodies they got there. Thank you.